We start. So the topic today, as you all heard, is Kathakalkappuram. It's a Malayalam word, but the whole talk is going to be in English. So Kathakalkappuram basically means beyond the stories. So what exactly is this topic? It's a journey into the journey behind Puranic stories. And why are we doing it? Because we are looking for the intent, we are looking for the interpretations, we are looking for the symbolism, the inner meaning, and the religious significance all these Puranic stories are expounding. So, before we start that, let's look at the evolution of storytelling. So, storytelling is a very old, ancient art. So, thousands and thousands of years ago, when the early human inhabitants recognized that during early phases of oral communication, when a simple information or a complex information was told in a story format, human beings were able to relate and communicate better. Linguistic anthropologists, they claim that this particular behavior, very unique to humans, gave birth to stories. So that is how stories started. So the early human inhabitants in this earth, billions and billions of years back, used this wonderful storytelling technique as a ritual to associate and also to socialize, to make sense of their world, address or get rid of their unknown fear, share understanding, share their experience with others and future generations. So the moment when you say panda 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 in Malayalam, or when somebody says ek zamane mein in Hindi, or when you look in Tamil when you say oh munnoru kalathula, that basically translates to once upon a time in English. The moment you hear that, every human being, be it a child or a teenager or an adult or a senior citizen, they get completely hooked on and they are so much excited to hearing the rest. That is the effect and power of a story. From a perspective, the first recorded story, as per historians, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have read about it in the history lessons. So historians say that this was written approximately 5,000 years ago, and this story began to spread from Mesopotamia to the other parts of Asia and Europe. Nobody knows how old our Sanatana Dharma really is. We have millions and millions of stories in Sanatana Dharma which are older than Epic of Gilgamesh. So how did we record the stories? To understand this, we need to understand the layout of our scriptures. So our scriptures are commonly divided into 6 main categories: Shrutis, Smritis, Itihasas, Puranas, Agamas, and Darshanas. So these are the 6 main categories on which our scriptures are divided. Among it, there's 2 things which really stand apart here from a story perspective. They are the Itihasas and Puranas. So Itihasas basically mean the way it is. So the epics such as Ramayanam, Mahabharatam all fall into this group. What happens in Itihasas is the profound philosophical information that is contained in the Shrutis and the Smritis are narrated in the form of detailed stories. And they add a lot of fantasy and mythical elements to it. And when it comes to Puranas, they conveyed the truth of the Veda using stories, but the difference here in Puranas is you have a non-recurrent characters. They're all different characters. And Puranas, unlike Itihasas, the topics were very diverse. So some Puranas talks about cosmology, some talks about the gods, the goddesses, the kings, the heroes, the sages, the pilgrimages, and all. So what happened was the storytelling was started to supplement the Shruti type of learning. So when it comes to the Shruti type of learning, it is the oral tradition that happens. That is where the teacher, he or she starts to dictate the materials to the students or the Shishyas, and the students or the Shishyas, they try to recite it, they try to repeat it after the teacher, and they slowly memorize the text. So, according to Vedic scholars, the oral storytelling was practiced very, very, very long ago. And after thousands of years, the oral tradition slowly started moving into a written form. So that is when all the stories started being written down. So that is why you don't find any stories older than Gilgamesh, because during those times it was completely an oral tradition. The Vedic scholars use these kind of stories to teach, basically to instruct lessons to students. The storyteller and the listeners were physically very close, and they were often seated together in a circular or a semicircular fashion. So, when the Puranic stories were being told, retold, revised, improvised, and shared, the cultural, the social, the moral, ethical, and the dharmic and the spiritual Vedantic matters, which were very, very difficult to grasp for the layperson, were slowly broken into simple stories, emphasizing the value of love, togetherness, forgiveness, and to strive for the better. And they started conveying these wonderful concepts to our scriptures. So, when Puranic stories were told, retold, revised, improvised, and shared, there was a lot of ideas there which was very difficult for a layperson to comprehend. So, they were broken down into simple stories. And these simple stories were better used to convey the teachings of our scriptures. So, when you start looking at Puranic stories, every Puranic story had 5 essential components in it. So it was the characters, the setting, the plot, the conflict, and finally the resolution. So these essential elements that kept the story running smoothly and allowed the action to develop in a very logical manner so all these readers can understand. And what happened in the Puranic stories was improvisations were constantly made at the early stages. And the story structure, the content, they changed and they morphed according to the societal, geographical, and cultural demands. So that is why you see multiple storylines emanating from different parts taking different directions. And theatrical effects were impregnated, the sound modulations were made, the special voice effects and the tonal embellishments were often used in the narratives based on the skill of the storyteller. So what happened with all these effects is because the story started gaining a lot of momentum and it started reaching the intended audience and it stayed with them for a very long time. So you have the Vedic rishis, the male ones, and the rishikas, the female ones, whom we commonly call as drishtas, and various other authors of our scriptures. They started purposely embedding a lot of explicit clues all over the story. And there was a special reason they were doing it. It was intended for all the inquisitive, curious learners, the jignasus, so that they can seek the hidden meaning, and it will prompt the jignasus to read between the lines so that they can enhance in their Vedantic learning process. So all this led these jignasus or the seekers to ponder, to mull, to reflect, to meditate, and to seek the ultimate truth, which in Vedanta we call as the Atma Jnanam or the Brahma Jnanam. So when we had such a wonderful thing, you would wonder, how did things take a different turn? How did we end up currently where we are now? So it all started happening during the invasion, starting from the Greeks with a very little effect. And then when all the Islamic invasion started, the whole momentum started to change. And the last nail on the coffin was during the early European invaders. When they started coming in, the Danish came, the Dutch came, the French were there, the Portuguese and the British, they were all came and started invading India. And these people who were invading India were not exposed to our culture, nor our traditions or dharma. They had no clue about our civilization, and their knowledge on Sanatana Dharma was almost nil. These invaders had a preconceived, erroneous notion that these dark skinned Asian people were uncultured, uncivilized, unsophisticated, barbaric, primitive, and uneducated. So, when they started hearing bits and pieces of a Puranic story from various non reliable sources, with their limited language and the below average subject knowledge skills, coupled with the preconceived notions and unreceptiveness to new ideas and thoughts. So, in the last 30 seconds, we were totally discussing how did things change. We were talking about the invasion that happened, and the last nail on the coffin, we were talking about was the European invaders who came. The Danish, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, and the British. So these invaders from these main 5 countries, they were not exposed to our culture. They were not exposed to our traditions or dharma. They had no clue about our civilization, and their knowledge on the Sanatana Dharma was almost nil. And these invaders, they had a preconceived, erroneous notion that these dark-skinned Asian people were uncultured, uncivilized, unsophisticated, barbaric, primitive, and uneducated. So when they started getting or hearing these kind of bits and pieces of a Puranic story through various non-reliable sources, with their limited knowledge and with their below average subject knowledge skills, coupled with their preconceived notions and unreceptiveness to new ideas and thoughts, their closed mind could neither understand nor decipher the crux of our Puranic stories. Hey, so what happened then? They started looking at all the Puranic stories, and they started framing all Puranic stories as cock and bull stories. They started claiming they were a highly concocted, ridiculous piece of fiction, untrustworthy, and a piece of sheer imaginative prehistoric fiction. So when all this happened in the 1800s and the 1900s, a lot of Indians started undergoing Western style of education. They started to read these opinions, they started to read these books, and they got carried away by the mistaken Western information and started believing what was stated as the absolute truth. That was a major decision that took us in the wrong direction. Thus, they mischaracterized, they misconstrued information which totally lacked any scholarly skill and knowledge, spread far and wide, and got accepted as a norm. And we kept saying that the Upanishadic philosophy was one of the main reasons that they had to pass on. So let's all look at how it contributed to our stories. So that's we looked at the history now, and we realized where we are at the right location. So the philosophy in the Upanishads is very far or is too subtle for an average intellect to comprehend. So the Upanishadic philosophy is too subtle for an average intellect to comprehend. We all know that. So what our teachers did was, if a person fails to comprehend or understand the Upanishadic meaning, they realize that the person will never apply it to their mind. So they wanted to change the trend. So that is how this novel idea of embedding the Puranic stories with multiple layers of Upanishadic meaning started coming up. So imagine you have a bud in your hand with multiple petals, and every layer of bud, the way you slowly start to peel it, has different meanings, a different context. And it all is based on the individual caliber and the stages of learning. As you slowly peel the petals and go inside the flower, the complexity increases. The learning process increases. The whole dimension changes, and the stages of learning keeps increasing. The more it goes more deeper and deeper into the inner philosophical or inner Upanishadic core. That's how the whole story was structured. Not many people know that, so that is how we are going to look at the stories right now. So as we peel each back layer, the more awareness comes in, the more discovery comes in. So the same story was interpreted by the uneducated people, the beginners, the intermediate people, and the advanced students in different contexts and based on the levels of understanding. So when a curious student starts to analyze these kind of stories through scriptures or with the help of learned scholars, the hidden symbolism in the story, the concealed meaning, the true intent, and the significance slowly unfurls, revealing the very essence of spirituality expounded in our Sanatana Dharma. So let's also look at this kind of storytelling from a psychological perspective. How does it affect an individual who's reading it or listening to it? So from a psychological perspective, when a story is told, the person who hears it, what happens is like the person who hears it or reads it try to associate themselves with one of the characters that they can relate to. And they slowly start to develop a bond. This is a first step. This way, when we hear the story, the message that is driven by the story gets deeply impregnated in our minds. And this helps the reader or the listener to absorb the information of the story and connect the contents of the story with their own experiences in a world in a very personalized manner. That is a subtle point of a story, because we start to connect to the story, linking it with our own experiences in a very personalized manner. That is the hallmark of Sanatana Dharma, which allows the seeker to invent his or own dharmic path to connect with the God, the Ishvara or the Ishta Devata concept. And once you get connected, once you get familiarized, the person finally understands the overall concept, the concept of the Brahman, and it helps them to merge with the Brahman. So that is a wonderful concept of whole Advaita philosophy that was deeply ingrained in these wonderful stories. But we never stopped there. We went still further. And what did we do? Once we started hearing the stories, we started to think. We started to reflect upon the stories. We started to visualize the Puranic stories, the concepts. Then we slowly started to live up to the standards, continuously meditating on it. And we slowly started to transform us. The moment we started to transform us, the family starts to transform, the family starts to transform, the neighborhood started to transform, and the whole community was transforming. So we started thinking, we started reflecting, we started visualizing, we started meditating, and we started transforming. This is exactly described in the Sanatana Dharma as a wonderful threefold process: the Shravana, the Manana, and the Nididhyasana. The Shravana, where you have the hearing and studying, the Manana, where you have the contemplation, and Nididhyasana, where you live and breathe according to the principles. So when you start going through these ones, it starts to be a complete awakening for you, and it helps the individual who reads the story, who understands the story, and who tries to grasp inner meaning. It takes them closer and closer to the self-realization mode. So this is where we are trying to go with Kathakalkappuram, beyond the stories. It's a journey into the journey behind stories. So let's see, for every Puranic story we have heard so far, every Puranic story had a moral, a quick wit, a suspense, a twist, a dashing characters, strange quirk of fate, enigmatic questions were asked in all these Puranic stories. There were some frustrations, there were some dilemmas, there were surprising answers, and finally every Puranic story had a valuable lesson to learn. Often, by the end of the story, we gained a new perspective about our feelings, our emotions. Every Puranic story stimulates creative imagination within us. It creates a wisdom, a compassion for all living creatures we are cohabiting with. That was such a unique philosophy to Sanatana Dharma. We have heard the concept, Kud Jio Aur Ko Bhi Jeene Do, live and let live concept. the unique philosophy of Sanatana Dharma. They were all highly popularized through the stories. So when these Puranic stories were written for the benefit of students for the spiritual path, it started contributing to a very strong mind and thoughts. So the literal meaning of every story, we look at it from an outward perspective, may look so worldly. But when you started looking into the inner meaning, the essence gets spiritual. The deeper and deeper you go into the story, the more dazzled you become. So because every story has some sort of meaning to it. But if you ask a question, does all the stories in Puranas do have a deep meaning? Not exactly. Not all the stories do have it, but most stories do have it. It's because some of the authors of the Puranic stories did use a poetic freedom. They did use their imagination to add a lot of frills. Because it's a story after all, right? So they might have added something. But what we need to do is we need to look at it from a very prudent perspective. Because they always say that the wise take the hidden meaning, while the ignorant cling to the literal meaning. Whereas the disbelieving people, on the other hand, these kind of so-called the intellectual hardcore atheist, in Malayalam we call them as Bujis or the Buddhijivis. They derive pleasure from criticizing the unbelievable part of the story, and they try to score their point of knowledge based on rationality and discredit the whole process. Because Hindu scriptures are replete with metaphors. They contain deep philosophical truth. All Hindu Puranic stories are couched in symbolism. And it's very difficult not to overlook these things. Because the moment you start looking into the deeper meanings, you go over you just skim over it, you're not doing justice to it. Very similar to science and mathematics, you need to grasp the underlying phenomena or the foundation on which the whole theory is based. Then we would be able to fathom the soul of the story. Because wisdom, as they say in Sanatana Dharma, comes not from mere reading, but from churning the thought and from grasping the hidden inner meaning. That is why our Puranic stories often use the simile. The churning the butter from the milk. That is what it is. So what's going to happen is, since we discussed quite a lot of theoretical stuff, approximately 30 minutes of our time is gone. So let's look at one particular story. And let's see how to look deeper into the story. Because the story, what we're going to read, what I'm going to say today, because I had quite a few stories with me. Since we are running short of time, I'm just going to pick one. So let's look at the story of Dhruva. The story of Dhruva was stated in Srimad Bhagavatam, and it's also in Vishnu Purana as well. And there was a king, and his name was King Uttanapadan. So the king Uttanapadan had two wives, Suniti and Surichi. Suniti was the first wife. Then after a few years, he married Surichi. The king Uttanapadan with Suniti, the first wife, had a son. His name was Dhruva. And with the second wife, he had a son too. His name was Uttama. And Uttama was just 1 year younger to Dhruva. So when Dhruva was approximately 5 years of age, from the context of the story, Uttama was approximately 4 years old. The second wife, Surichi, was very possessive and she was very scheming. She always made it a point to keep a distance, to create a distance between the king Uttanapadan and the first wife Suniti. Because she always wanted to get her attention, she always wanted to steal the show. And this poor king, he is a guy who couldn't think straight. He was getting more and more attached to his second wife because the second wife was much more beautiful to look at. She was much more pleasing. And he was getting more attached to his second wife. And the second wife used this opportunity to push their son, the Uttama, much more closer and closer to the king Uttanapadan. So one day when Dhruva was entering the palace, he saw his dad Uttanapadan sitting, and Uttama, his step brother, was sitting on his lap and playing with his king. So this Dhruva, who was just a 5-year-old boy, thought, my dad is playing with my little brother. Why don't I go and sit on his other lap? So Dhruva comes running to the king and says, Dad, can I sit on your other lap too? The dad looks at him, hesitating, and is about to pick up Dhruva. Suddenly the second wife, Surichi, comes running inside and he pushes Dhruva down and says, "No." She starts to scold the king and say, "No, this kid is not sitting on your lap because I did not give birth to this boy. This boy was not born out of my womb. My boy is Uttama and Uttama wants to sit it." And Dhruva didn't know what was happening. He was looking at it. He was completely heartbroken. He was completely saddened. This is just a 5-year-old boy who's being mistreated by his stepmom, and his dad and his stepbrother are just looking at him as mere spectators. He didn't know what to do. Tears was running down the cheeks, and he started running to his mother's quarters. And there, Suniti was standing there. Suniti saw this Dhruva running by, and she hugged him and asked him what was happening. Sunita, she knew something was wrong, and this highly sensitive and highly respectful little kid told the whole story to her. And his mom said to Dhruva, "There's nothing much I can do, little boy. If you want to get an answer for it, you need to go and talk to the Lord himself. You need to go and approach the Lord." So seeking the Lord was his only refuge. So hearing this mother's words, Dhruva, this 5-year boy, started leaving the city and started walking through the forest, and there he met Sage Narada. So the Sage Narada chats with him for a few minutes, and once Sage Narada realizes what the intent of the kid and how strong-willed he is, how determined he is, he teaches him a secret mantra. And this little Dhruva goes and meditates for 6 months, and finally Lord Vishnu is manifested before Lord Dhruva. So when Lord Vishnu is manifested before Dhruva, Dhruva is completely shaken. He looks at the Lord and says, "Lord, I want to sing a praise, but I don't know what else I have to do. Words are not coming out of my mouth." So that is a time when the Lord takes his conch, his panchajanyam, and touches his cheek of little Dhruva. Immediately Dhruva gets purified. He becomes enlightened by the sheer touch of the conch. And he renders a beautiful prayer, Dhruvastuti. And the story goes saying that he comes back to the kingdom after that. When his little brother goes for a hunting or a war, then he gets killed. Then Dhruva rules the kingdom for a very long time. Then he finally becomes the pole star, the Dhruvatara or the Dhruva Nakshatra. So that is how the story goes. Now what we try to do is we try to analyze the story, because the intent here is to look into the journey behind the journey, right? So what happens is let's look at from an etiological perspective. So the etiological perspective, when you start looking at a story, what it tries to do is it tries to explain something with a reason. So it sees how Dhruva occupied the most exalted position. The most exalted or the fixed position is the position of the Dhruva Nakshatra, the constellation of Saptarishis, and every galaxy, they revolve around this Dhruva Nakshatra. He is the one fixated object here. So it looks it from that perspective. And look at the other irony as well. The little Dhruva was refused his father's lap, but he ends up getting an opportunity to sit on none other than Lord Vishnu's lap. That is how things turning there. Then we'll also look at from an allegorical perspective, where we try to see what are all the hidden meanings we have in the story. When the story was formulated, how were those 5 essential components in the story which we looked at: the characters, the setting, the plot, the conflict, and the resolution. How are these things are getting intertwined? Where are all these little hidden meanings are coming from? So let's start with the king, King Uttanapadan. He was a king, but he lacked the basic quality of being a king. The king's basic quality, according to Dharma Shastras, is to treat everyone equal. Was he treating everyone equal? No. He was completely obsessed with his second wife and he feared her. So favoritism was a big part for this king. He was not a true king. He was not willing to accommodate or give equal love to his children. Uttama was treated separately, or Uttama was treated a lot different from how Dhruva was said. He was favoring one over the other. When a person or a king, he does that in his home or palace. Just imagine what he will be doing to the praja or the whole kingdom. Let's look at the first wife, Suniti. Suniti is very gentle. She's very obedient. She's very submissive. But she could not exert any influence on her husband. She was soft spoken. She was following all the rules and etiquette. She was highly knowledgeable. But just because she was not good looking, the king was not fond of her. But when the occasion demanded, she was smart enough to guide her son, which happened to be the turning point of the story. Because she was able to say to Dhruva, Dhruva, my child, do not despair. When you are mocked by arrogant people, Lord Vishnu is the only Redeemer. He will show you the path for salvation. So at least she used that one particular opportunity where a parent has to step in and guide the child. Look at the stepmother here, his second wife, Suruchi. She was extremely attractive. She was highly sensual. She was gratifying from every perspective the king could imagine. She was also very jealous. She could be easily provoked. She was highly scheming. She had total control of her husband. And the intention behind her was to possess the throne and all of the material benefit that comes along with it. That was the sole reason she was trying to push Uttama towards that direction. She was pretty mean as well. What kind of stepmother would say to a 5-year-old child that unless otherwise you are not born in my womb, you do not have the right to sit on your biological father's lap? That really shows the mean quality in her. Look at the other character, Dhruva, the legal heir. He's the oldest. Legally, he is a prince. Being the son of the king, Dhruva lacked nothing by way of material comforts. But there's one thing he lacked a lot. It was his father's love and affection. But he was determined to seek for himself his rightful place. So that was the only reason he went to the forest called the Madhuvanam. He did tapasya for 6 months. And slowly he was discarding it. He was discarding fruits, he was discarding vegetables, he started living on leaves and barks. Then slowly he started stopping his consumption of food and water and even air to some extent. Because his mind was fixed only on the Lord. His entire senses were totally under control. He was able to overcome hunger and his desires. Nothing could distract or divert his steadfast attention. His steadfast attention is something that's remarkable. And that's what Vedanta talks about too as well. Because it says a true jnani should have freedom from all emotional disturbances. A true jnani has to be free from attachment, from fear, from anger, from elation, from intolerance, from jealousy, from anxiety, and every negative emotions. So this little Dhruva was an embodiment to it. And when you go back into Vedanta, when you start looking at the fourfold qualification, this sadhana chadushtayam, which we already looked at in our classes, you look at the 4 aspects. You look about vivekam, the discrimination, the right judgment, the right understanding, the differentiation of the permanent and the impermanent. This 5-year-old boy had it. Then you look at vairagyam, which the English translation is dispassion. Freedom from attachment and freedom from aversion. This toddler had it. Then comes the third one from Sadhana Chadushtayam, the mumukshutvam, the desire, the burning desire for freedom. This lad had it. Then comes the Shat Sampati, the Shama, Dama, Uparama, Titiksha, Shraddha and Samadhana. This little kid was an embodiment to it. So there was quite a lot of meanings hidden for a Vedantic seeker, and they were all hidden in the characterization of Dhruva. So when Lord Vishnu manifested with Garuda just in front of Dhruva, the other persons who would have meditated for such a long time would have asked for worldly or heavenly pleasures or even moksha. But look at this little boy. He did not have any personal desire. He did not have any personal desire. He had renunciated all desires, which was truly essential in a Vedantic spirit, and he had reached the highest caliber one can ever think of. That's the state called Dhruvapadam. So that is one of the reasons he was the best suited person to sit on God's lap. And that is why he became the pole star, the North Star. So if you look into the astronomy basics, they say the North Star is the one that is always fixed. It is always aligned with Earth's axis of rotation. Then you look at the other character we have in the story, Narada Muni, or the sage Narada. So whenever Narada comes into a story, we always think, from what we have heard, that he's a troublemaker. He comes, he stirs up trouble. But actually that's not the case. Whenever Narada Muni comes, what he does is he creates a little bit of confusion and trouble, but when it starts clearing up, he always shows the seeker the right path. So from that perspective, when you start looking at all the puranic stories, what happens after Narada Rishi's visit, you will see it from a different perspective. And when he sees this little kid, Dhruva, go running towards the Madhuvanam for deep meditation, he stops the kid and he asks 4 questions. Hey boy, aren't you too young for such a serious undertaking? Then he says, isn't God everywhere anyway? Why do you want to go into the deep forest and meditate? Why do you want to go into a deep forest which is filled with all ferocious animals? And for each and every question, he gets a response from Dhruva. Then he even asks the little Dhruva, what does a God look like? See, so these are the things or the questions Narada Muni is asking to make sure that this little kid is completely determined. And when he makes sure that this kid is on the right direction, he's all set, he gives him a secret mantra. And that instruction leads him to an austere life. So when we said that when Lord Vishnu came up or got manifested in front of Dhruva, he used a panchajanyam or the conch to touch his cheeks. The conch in Hindu philosophy or from Vaishnavite philosophy is a seed of all sound. It's a Shabda Brahman. So from the conch, the moment he touches him, he gets enlightened. And that's how a beautiful poem in praise of Lord Vishnu comes up from his words. It's a 12 powerful verses, and that's what we call as a Dhruvastuti. Then we look at other wonderful small tips that's been laid off. So that when we hear the word Uttanapadan basically means in Sanskrit, one who has legs upright. That basically means one who has legs up in the air and not firmly grounded. Someone who's laid back. So this laid back attitude denotes the common trait which we all have. And Uttanapadan, along with his laid back attitude, got 2 spouses or 2 wives. And what are these wives or companions? How do we look at it? The elder one is called Suniti and the younger one is called Surichi. What does Suniti means? Su stands for correct or proper, and Niti means prudence or morality. That is why she was always according to the books and traditions, and she was straightforward. And what was the second one? Surichi. Su, quickly, correct. Ruchi, interest or desire. So she was the one who was more of a sensual, pleasure gratifying person. She was the one more desirous. She was the one inducing him, exciting him. So it's right in the names, you see the names there. So that is why even though Uttanapadan was married to Suniti, the first wife, who was an embodiment of morality, he was always attracted to his second wife, Suniti, because she was an embodiment of desire. Because the whole process arose because the Uttanapadan loved his second wife more than the first one. He was addicted to sensual pleasure and quick gratification. It happens in our life as well. Because the moment of attraction or the sensual pleasure comes, it always takes an upper hand than morality. Similarly, when our senses start to tingle, prudence, morality, and intellect always takes a backseat. Let's look at the boys' names as well. We looked at Uttanapada and Suniti, Surichi. Looked at Dhruva. Dhruva basically means stable, steadfast, eternal, unchangeable. See, all the clues are there in the meanings or the wonderful names. And what happens to Uttama? Uttama means someone who is elevated or greatest. So when the morality prevails, we become stable, if not great. But when desire drives us, we always try to reach the exalted or the pivotal position in life. So at the end of the story, we witness that Dhruva is a stable one. He's the eternal one. He's a firm character. And he prevailed over Uttama, whose name meant the best or the greatest. And similarly, stability and firmness. Suniti is the absolute truth which can make us shine forever, even when our body departs or gets aged, or when we lose the charm. That's the world of Surichi. Because every taste that tingles within you has got a life expectancy of its own. It's not going to last forever. Dhruva practiced perseverance. He was completely devoted. He was steadfast. He was fearless in his quest for attaining the highest position in life. So this story shows how human desires create suffering in the material world. And it clearly shows us that the only way to outgrow this desire is through devotion to God. So the only way to outgrow this desire is through the devotion of God. And that happens to be the foundation on which our wonderful bhakti tradition of Sanatana Dharma stands. So that is why when you start reading all the bhakti texts, a lot of stories of Dhruva comes in. Then we kept saying that there was a secret mantra that was revealed to Dhruva. So you may wonder what it is. So Vishnu Puranam says it is none other than Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya is a moksha mantra or a mukti mantra. Our scriptures say that when you start reciting this, you get a spiritual freedom from samsara, which is nothing but the recurring cycle of birth and death. Punarapi Jananam, Punarapi Maranam, as Shankara Bhagavad points out. And the meaning of the individual words in this wonderful mantra, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, means it's pretty simple. Om, the primordial sacred sound vibration on which the whole universe is based. Namo, it's a salutation. It also means you're having a complete surrender to the Lord. Sharanagati. Bhagavate, the meaning which means one who is divine and blessed. Vasudevaya, that is the infinite and the formless of the Brahman. So that is such a wonderful meaning of this mantra. I had quite a few stories as well to share.